Imagine standing in the vast blistering deserts of modern-day Iraq. The scorching wind howls, blowing away thousands of years of golden sand to reveal something entirely unexpected. The crumbling, majestic ruins of a forgotten world. Buried deep within these ruins are thousands of ancient clay tablets, etched with strange, wedge-shaped symbols. For centuries these tablets lay silent in the dark, guarding a story so explosive that it challenges everything we thought we knew about who we are and where we came from. We have all heard the traditional story of human origins. We learn in school that humanity evolved slowly, step by step, over millions of years. But what if that story is missing a crucial chapter? What if the sudden, dramatic leap in human intelligence was not just a lucky accident of nature, but the result of a deliberate intervention by visitors from the stars? According to the ancient texts of Mesopotamia, the very cradle of human civilization, this is exactly what happened. These ancient records speak of a mysterious group of beings known as the Anunnaki. In the ancient Sumerian language, their name translates to something profound. Those who from heaven to earth came. But here is the biggest secret of all. They did not travel across the endless cosmic void to conquer us. And they certainly did not come here on a grand galactic vacation. They came here out of absolute desperation. They arrived on Earth for a massive, high-stakes survival mission driven by a catastrophic crisis that was actively tearing their home planet apart. They needed something that our young blue world had in abundance. Something that would ultimately tie their alien destiny to the very creation of mankind itself. Are you ready to uncover the hidden truth behind the greatest archaeological mystery in human history? Before we dive deep into the sands of time and decode the ancient secrets of the Anunnaki, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode of our journey into the unknown. Now, let us travel back to the very dawn of civilization and discover why the Anunnaki really came to Earth. To truly understand the incredible story of the Anunnaki, we must first travel back in time, far beyond the days of the Roman Empire, beyond the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, and even beyond the oldest stories written in the Bible. We must journey back over 6,000 years to a place that historians call the cradle of civilization. This region, known in antiquity as Mesopotamia, was nestled largely within the borders of what we now know as the modern country of Iraq. The word Mesopotamia literally translates from ancient Greek to mean the land between the rivers. The two rivers in question, the mighty Tigris and the winding Euphrates, were the absolute lifelines of this ancient world. Today, if you were to visit this region, you might see endless stretches of arid, dry landscapes. But thousands of years ago, this land was a lush, vibrant, and fertile paradise. Before Mesopotamia, human beings were largely nomadic hunter-gatherers. Our ancestors spent their entire lives constantly on the move, chasing herds of animals and foraging for wild plants just to survive another day. There were no cities, no written laws, and no grand architecture. But then, seemingly overnight in the grand scheme of human history, something miraculous happened in this land between the rivers. A mysterious and highly advanced group of people known as the Sumerians suddenly emerged. They stopped wandering and began to build. And they did not just build simple huts. They constructed massive, sprawling megacities out of the mud and clay of the riverbanks. Cities with names like Uruk, and Eridu rose toward the sky. The Sumerians were pioneers of the modern world in ways that are almost difficult to comprehend. They invented the wheel, allowing them to transport heavy goods across vast distances. They invented the plough, which revolutionized agriculture and allowed them to grow enough food to sustain massive populations. They divided the sky into the signs of the zodiac, mapped the stars with astonishing precision, and divided time into the 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours that we still use on our clocks and smartphones today. They established complex legal systems, schools, and bustling marketplaces. But of all their astonishing achievements, their greatest invention the one that allows us to hear their voices across the millennia, was the invention of writing. Imagine living in a world where paper does not exist. There are no books, no hard drives, and no cloud storage. If a merchant wanted to keep a record of how many sheep he sold, or if a king wanted to record the laws of his land, how could they do it so that the information would last? The Sumerians found the answer in the very earth they walked upon. They took the thick, wet mud from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and moulded this into smooth, flat tablets. Then they took a reed from the riverbank, cut it at an angle to create a sharp, wedge-shaped tip, and used it to press symbols into the soft, wet clay. This ingenious system of writing is known today as cuneiform, a word that simply means wedge-shaped. Once the clay tablet was covered in these wedge-shaped symbols, the Sumerians would leave it out to bake and harden under the blistering Middle Eastern sun. Sometimes they would even fire the tablets in kilns, turning the soft mud into solid stone. This is a crucial detail to understand. When modern civilizations record information on paper, that paper will eventually rot, tear, or burn. Even our digital data can be wiped out in an instant, but a baked clay tablet, it is virtually indestructible. If a library full of paper books catches fire, the history is lost forever. But when invading armies burned down the ancient Sumerian cities, the intense heat of the fires actually baked the clay tablets even harder, preserving them perfectly under the rubble for thousands of years. For millennia, the glorious cities of Mesopotamia lay buried under mountains of dirt and sand, completely forgotten by humanity. It was not until the 19th century that intrepid archaeologists began digging into these strange hills in the Iraqi desert. What they found completely shattered the historical timeline. They uncovered the walls of the ancient cities, the foundations of massive temples, and most importantly, they discovered the libraries. Archaeologists unearthed millions of these clay tablets, creating a mountain of ancient data that had been sealed away in a time capsule of Earth. However, discovering the tablets was only the first step. The cuneiform script had not been spoken or read by a living human being for thousands of years. It was a completely dead language, a complex puzzle of intersecting wedges and lines that looked more like bird footprints than a readable text. It took brilliant linguists and scholars decades of painstaking work to finally crack the code. When they did, they expected to find simple records of grain sales, marriage contracts, and mundane daily events. While they certainly found plenty of those, they also found something that sent shockwaves through the historical community. They found the Sumerians' own recorded history of their origins. As scholars translated the epic poems, the creation myths, and the royal decrees, a specific group of characters kept appearing over and over again in the texts. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. For a long time, traditional historians and archaeologists simply categorized the Anunnaki as the mythological gods of the ancient world, similar to the gods of Mount Olympus in Greek mythology. They assumed that the Sumerians, like all primitive people, invented invisible sky gods to explain natural phenomena like thunderstorms, earthquakes, and the changing of the seasons. But as the translations became more accurate, and as alternative researchers began to look at the text without the bias of modern assumptions, a very different picture began to emerge. The word Anunnaki is not a mystical, abstract concept. In the ancient Sumerian language, the word can be broken down quite literally. Anu refers to the heavens or the sky, and Ki refers to the earth. Therefore, the literal translation of Anunnaki is those who from heaven to earth came. The ancient Sumerian texts did not describe the Anunnaki as invisible, ethereal spirits living in some mystical realm. Instead, they described them as physical, tangible, biological beings. According to the clay tablets, these beings walked among the people. They ate food, they drank water, they got into arguments, they fought wars, and they possessed technology that must have seemed like absolute magic to the early humans. The Sumerians recorded that these beings flew through the skies in sky chariots, that roared with fire and smoke. They used weapons that could level mountains, and they possessed medical knowledge that could alter the very fabric of life. One of the most fascinating pieces of evidence found in the Mesopotamian ruins is an artifact known as the Sumerian King List. This is a physical stone prism that records the names of the ancient kings who ruled over the land, along with the lengths of their reigns. What makes the King List so baffling to modern historians is that it treats the Anunnaki not as myths, but as historical royalty. The early parts of the list describe kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, lifespans that are biologically impossible for human beings. The text explicitly states that kingship descended from heaven, implying that the first rulers of Earth were not human at all, but rather the Anunnaki themselves. The list seamlessly transitions from these immensely long-lived extraterrestrial rulers down to the more recent normal human kings whose existences have been verified by modern archaeology. To the Sumerians, there was no dividing line between the mythology of the gods and the factual history of their nation. It was all one continuous true story. So, if we entertain the idea that the ancient Sumerians were not just writing fantasy novels in the mud, but were instead diligently acting as journalists recording the actual events of their time, we are left with a staggering conclusion. The Anunnaki were real. They were advanced visitors from another place in the cosmos who physically touched down in the Middle East. But this realization immediately gives birth to an even larger, more pressing question. Space is unfathomably massive. The distances between stars are so vast that they boggle the human mind. Travelling across the cosmos requires an unimaginable amount of energy, resources, and time. An advanced civilization does not undertake a journey like that simply to sightsee or to build mud brick cities for primitive cavemen. They must have had a profoundly important reason to cross the dark, freezing void of space to locate our specific blue planet. As researchers dug deeper into the translated texts, piecing together the ancient epics like the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis, the shocking motive finally revealed itself. The Anunnaki did not come to Earth to play God. They came to Earth out of absolute necessity. They were a civilization on the very brink of total extinction, fleeing an environmental catastrophe on a massive rogue planet known as Nibiru. And to save their dying home, they needed to strip mine the Earth for a very specific, precious resource. To comprehend the sheer desperation that drove the Anunnaki to our world, we must first look up at the stars through the eyes of the ancient Sumerians. Long before the invention of the modern telescope, long before Galileo or Copernicus pointed their crude glass lenses toward the night sky, the Sumerians possessed an inexplicably profound understanding of our solar system. On various clay tablets and cylindrical stone seals, most notably the famous artifact known as cylinder seal VEA243, currently housed in a museum in Berlin, the Sumerians depicted a model of our solar system that is shockingly accurate. They placed the Sun dead centre rather than the Earth, completely bypassing the geocentric misunderstanding that would plague European astronomers thousands of years later. Even more astonishingly, they accurately depicted the outer planets of our solar system: Uranus, Neptune, and even distant Pluto. Remember, Uranus was not officially discovered by modern science until 1781, Neptune in 1846, and Pluto in 1930. Yet somehow, a civilization building mud brick cities 6 millennia ago knew exactly where these celestial bodies were located. But there is a catch. When modern scholars count the planets on these ancient Sumerian star maps, there is one too many. Alongside the planets we know and recognize today, the ancient texts describe another massive celestial body. They called it the 12th planet, counting the Sun, the Moon, and the 10 planets in their cosmological system. The specific name the Sumerians gave to this mysterious world was Nibiru, which translates roughly to the planet of the crossing. According to the translated cuneiform texts, Nibiru is not like the Earth, Mars or Venus, which all have relatively tight circular orbits around the Sun. Instead, Nibiru possesses a massive elongated elliptical orbit, much like a comet. This orbit is so vast that it takes Nibiru approximately 3,600 Earth years to complete a single journey around our Sun. The Sumerians called this 3,600-year cycle a Shah. Imagine what this means for a planet and its inhabitants. For a brief period during its orbit, Nibiru sweeps relatively close to the Sun, crossing through the inner solar system, but for the vast majority of its 3,600-year year, it is plunged into the deep, freezing, pitch-black abyss of deep space far beyond the reach of the Sun's warming rays. For life to exist on a planet that spends thousands of years in the freezing cosmic dark, that planet must have a very specific set of biological and geological conditions. It would need a powerful internal heat source, perhaps a highly active geothermal core to generate warmth from the inside out. But just as importantly, it would need a thick, robust and highly insulating atmosphere. You can think of this atmosphere like a massive planetary thermal blanket. When Nibiru was far from the Sun, this atmospheric blanket trapped the internal heat of the planet, keeping the Anunnaki safe and warm. When Nibiru swung close to the Sun during its crossing, the blanket acted as a shield, deflecting the intense, scorching solar radiation and preventing the planet's surface from catching fire. This delicate atmospheric balance was the absolute key to their survival. However, the ancient texts describe a terrifying crisis that began to unfold on Nibiru. Over countless millennia, their protective planetary blanket began to tear. Modern science has a term for this kind of event: atmospheric degradation or ozone depletion. We are actually quite familiar with this concept on Earth today. In the modern era, we constantly worry about greenhouse gases, chlorofluorocarbons destroying our ozone layer, and the deadly effects of cosmic radiation leaking through our atmosphere. We worry about polar ice caps melting and global temperatures rising. Now, take that modern climate anxiety and multiply it by 1,000. That is what the Anunnaki were facing. The ancient records suggest that due to natural celestial events, volcanic activity, or perhaps even the devastating aftermath of their own advanced nuclear technologies and wars, the atmosphere of Nibiru was developing massive holes. The consequences were apocalyptic. When Nibiru travelled far from the Sun, the precious internal heat of the planet was leaking out into the freezing void of space, causing global ice ages and massive crop failures. Conversely, when Nibiru approached the inner solar system, the lack of an atmospheric shield allowed lethal doses of solar radiation and ultraviolet light to scorch the surface, causing massive droughts, radiation sickness, and starvation. The Anunnaki were not merely facing a political crisis or an economic downturn, they were facing the absolute extinction of their entire species. Their greatest scientific minds scrambled for a solution. They realised that they needed to artificially patch the holes in their atmosphere. They needed to create a suspended, reflective shield high above the clouds that could bounce the dangerous solar radiation away while trapping the planet's internal heat inside. But what material in the universe could possibly achieve this? They needed an element that was highly reflective, highly malleable, utterly indestructible, and impervious to radiation. After what we can only assume was desperate research, they found their miracle element. It was gold. To a person without a scientific background, gold might seem like an odd choice to save a planet. On Earth, we mostly associate gold with wealth, luxury, jewellery, and ancient coins. We view it as a shiny status symbol. But if you strip away human economics and look at gold purely through the lens of physics and chemistry, it is arguably the most remarkable and magical element on the periodic table. First, gold is virtually indestructible. It does not rust, it does not tarnish, and it does not corrode. You can bury a solid gold ring in the damp earth or drop it into the salty ocean, and if someone digs it up 10,000 years later, it will still shine exactly as it did the day it was forged. Second, gold is incredibly malleable and ductile. A single ounce of gold can be beaten into a translucent sheet measuring roughly 300 square feet. But most importantly for the Anunnaki, gold is the ultimate reflector of radiation, specifically infrared and ultraviolet light. You do not need to take the ancient Sumerians' word for this. You only need to look at modern human space agencies like NASA. When NASA scientists send astronauts into the deadly radiation-filled vacuum of space, how do they protect their eyes and faces? If you look closely at the visor of an astronaut's spacesuit, you will notice a brilliant, mirror-like golden tint. That is not just for show. The visor is literally coated in a microscopic layer of real, pure gold to reflect the sun's lethal radiation and prevent the astronaut from going blind. When NASA launched the $10 billion James Webb Space Telescope to peer into the deepest corners of the universe, they coated its massive hexagonal mirrors in pure gold because it is the most efficient material in the universe for reflecting infrared light. Even the delicate electronic components inside our modern satellites and spacecraft are wrapped in gold foil to protect them from extreme temperature fluctuations and cosmic rays. The Anunnaki scientists realized that if they could mine enough gold, vaporize it, and spray it into the upper atmosphere of Nibiru as fine, microscopic dust, the suspended gold particles would act as a planetary mirror. It would perfectly reflect the freezing cold of deep space and the burning radiation of the sun, saving their dying world. There was only one massive problem. Nibiru had been stripped bare of its natural gold reserves. They had the technological solution, but they lacked the raw materials to execute it. Desperate to survive, they began sending automated probes and scanning equipment throughout the solar system, desperately searching the other planets for a high concentration of this precious metal. They checked the gas giants, the asteroid belts, and the barren rocks, and then their scanners lit up. They found a young, blue, water-rich planet located in the Goldilocks zone of the inner solar system. A planet whose crust and deep veins were practically bursting with gold. That planet was Earth. The discovery of Earth's vast gold reserves was the turning point in the history of the Anunnaki, and consequently the history of our world. They realized that their salvation was floating in the inner solar system, waiting to be harvested. But getting there would not be easy. It would require a monumental journey across the dangerous void of space, navigating past the treacherous asteroid belt and establishing a completely alien mining colony on a wild, untamed planet. The survival of their entire civilization now depended on a massive intergalactic mining operation. The stage was set, the coordinates were locked in, and the sky chariots were prepared for the long, perilous journey to a place they would come to call Ki, the Earth. The decision to travel to Earth was not made lightly. For the Anunnaki, it was a massive, unprecedented gamble. Leaving the relative, albeit fading safety of Nibiru meant boarding metallic vessels, described in the ancient Sumerian texts as roaring sky chariots or celestial boats, and launching into the dark, unforgiving expanse of the solar system. We have to pause and appreciate the sheer scale of this endeavour. When modern humans send a rover to Mars, a planet right next door, it takes months of travel and billions of dollars in scientific research. The Anunnaki were launching a massive fleet across the solar system, carrying heavy mining equipment, survival gear, and a crew of early astronauts who were terrified of what lay ahead in the black void. According to the ancient clay tablets, the journey from Nibiru to Earth was not a straight, easy shot. The texts describe a perilous flight path that required them to navigate past the massive gravitational pulls of the outer gas giants. But the greatest obstacle they faced was a treacherous region of space that the Sumerians called the Hammered Bracelet. What is truly mind-blowing is that the Sumerian text perfectly described the asteroid belt, a massive ring of jagged rocks, dust and planetary debris orbiting the Sun between Mars and Jupiter. In their epic creation myth, the Enuma Elish, the Sumerians recorded that a massive planetary collision in the deep past shattered a watery world called Tiamat. Half of this destroyed world became the Earth, and the shattered remnants of the other half were hammered out to form a bracelet in the sky. To modern astronomers, this hammered bracelet is the asteroid belt. The fact that a civilization living 6,000 years ago, long before the invention of optical telescopes, knew about a ring of invisible space debris millions of miles away is a profound mystery that traditional history struggles to explain. For the Anunnaki pilots, this asteroid belt was a deadly minefield. The ancient texts describe their ships being battered and violently shaken as they carefully navigated through the swirling vortex of jagged rocks. It was a terrifying gauntlet, a true test of their advanced aerospace engineering. But they pushed through the danger, driven by the knowledge that their families back on Nibiru were slowly suffocating under a dying sky. Finally, after navigating the dark void and surviving the hammered bracelet, the sky chariots broke through the clouds of a beautiful, vibrant blue and green world. They had arrived at Kai, the Earth. The landing was not a gentle touchdown on a concrete runway. The ancient records suggest that their primary spacecraft, massive and heavy, splashed down directly into the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. From these motherships, smaller landing crafts were deployed to the marshy shores. Imagine the scene. The massive metallic doors hiss open, and the first Anunnaki boots step down into the thick, wet mud of ancient Mesopotamia. They were aliens on a wild, untamed world, surrounded by dense reeds, wild animals, and a humid atmosphere that must have felt entirely foreign to their biology. They had no infrastructure, no paved roads, and no supply lines. They were entirely on their own, essentially setting up the very first extraterrestrial base camp in human history. The leader of this first Vanguard mission was a brilliant, highly capable Anunnaki prince named Ea. Later in the texts, he would be given the title Enki, which translates to Lord of the Earth. Enki was not a soldier. He was a master scientist, a geneticist, and a brilliant engineer. He was the kind of leader who understood the natural world. Under his direct command, the Anunnaki waded into the marshes and began to build their first settlement. They took the thick mud of the riverbanks, formed it into bricks, and baked them in the scorching sun. They erected the very first structures on Earth, not for human beings, but for themselves. They named this very first settlement Eridu. In the ancient Sumerian language, Eridu translates beautifully to home in the faraway. It was literally Earth Station 1. It is fascinating to note that modern archaeologists actually agree with the ancient texts on this specific point. The physical ruins of Eridu, located in southern Iraq, are widely considered by mainstream science to be one of the very first, if not the oldest, cities ever built in the world. But to the Anunnaki, Eridu was not a city in the traditional sense. It was a functional headquarters. It was their command centre, their sleeping quarters, and their primary laboratory for testing the water, soil, and minerals of this alien world. For a time, Enki and his crew worked tirelessly to establish a foothold on Earth. They set up water siphoning systems, built docking stations for their ships, and began the initial, rudimentary processes of searching for the gold they so desperately needed. But there was a massive problem. Extracting gold from seawater, which was Enki's initial plan, proved to be painfully slow and incredibly inefficient. The gold yields were simply too low. Back on Nibiru, the atmospheric crisis was worsening. The planetary leaders were growing impatient. The survival of their entire race was ticking down like a giant cosmic clock, and Enki was not producing results fast enough. Recognizing that the mission was failing its timeline, Anu, the supreme king of Nibiru and the father of Enki, made a drastic decision. He decided to send a second fleet to Earth, commanded by someone with a completely different skill set. He sent his other son, Enlil. The arrival of Enlil on Earth changed the dynamic of the entire mission and set the stage for a conflict that would eventually reshape the destiny of the planet. To understand the story of the Anunnaki, you must understand the deep, complex, and often bitter dynamic between these two brothers, Enki and Enlil. They are the two most important figures in ancient Mesopotamian history, and their contrasting personalities mirror the classic archetypes we see in mythologies and religions all over the world. Enki, the first arrival, was a creature of intellect. He was associated with the element of water. He was empathetic, curious, and held a deep appreciation for the natural beauty of the earth. He was an innovator who preferred to solve problems through science and genetic engineering. Enlil, on the other hand, whose name translates to Lord of the Air, or Lord of the Command, was a creature of strict order and authority. He was not a scientist. He was an uncompromising, iron-fisted military commander. He was sent to Earth to take charge, impose martial law on the operation, and get the gold flowing by any means necessary. Enlil had zero interest in exploring the Earth's natural wonders or studying its local flora and fauna. To him, Earth was simply a dirty, noisy, alien rock that held the resources Nibiru needed. He was a strict administrator who believed in hierarchy, discipline, and absolute obedience to the crown. But the tension between the two brothers was not just a clash of management styles, it was deeply rooted in the complex royal succession laws of Nibiru. This is where the story reads like a high-stakes extraterrestrial political drama. Enki was the firstborn son of King Anu. By all logical reasoning, Enki should have been the undisputed heir to the throne of Nibiru. However, Anunnaki royal law dictated a concept known as the seed of succession. According to this law, a son born to the king by his official royal half-sister held a purer genetic lineage than a firstborn son born to a standard concubine or lower-ranking wife. Enlil was born to King Anu and Anu's half-sister. Therefore, even though Enlil was younger than Enki, Enlil was the legal rightful heir to the throne. Imagine the intense, boiling resentment this created. Enki, the brilliant older brother who had braved the dangerous journey across the solar system, landed in the mud and built the first city from scratch, was suddenly demoted. He was forced to hand over supreme command of the Earth expedition to his younger militaristic brother. When Enlil arrived and took command, he immediately reorganized the entire planetary operation. He established a new headquarters, a grand control center in the heart of Mesopotamia. He took dominion over the Hakli, meaning the airways, the spaceport, and the overall command of the mission. Meanwhile, Enki was essentially pushed aside and reassigned. He was given dominion over the Abzu. For a long time, historians translated the word Abzu as a mythological underworld, a dark, watery abyss where demons lived. But modern researchers looking at the text through a technological lens have proposed a much more practical translation. The Abzu referred to the lower hemisphere of the Earth. Specifically, it referred to the deep, uncharted and incredibly dangerous territories of southern Africa. Enlil had realized that extracting gold from the ocean was useless. The real, massive veins of pure gold were buried deep underground in the rocky crust of southeastern Africa. He ordered the establishment of massive subterranean mining operations in the Abzu. Enki, the brilliant scientist, was sent down into the sweltering dark depths of the African continent to oversee this miserable, backbreaking labour. The stage was now set. The command centre was operating smoothly in Mesopotamia, under Enlil's iron fist, while deep in the south, the real, grueling work of tearing the earth apart was about to begin. It was a perfect, efficient corporate structure. But neither brother could have anticipated the catastrophic chain of events that this grueling mining operation was about to trigger. The Anunnaki were about to face a rebellion from within their own ranks, a violent uprising that would force Enki to perform the most controversial and consequential scientific experiment in the history of the universe. While the supreme commanders of the Anunnaki, Enlil and Enki, were busy establishing their administrative zones and arguing over the royal chain of command, a much darker reality was unfolding deep beneath the surface of the Earth. To understand this, we have to ask a very practical question. If Enlil was sitting in his grand Mesopotamian palace and Enki was managing the overall scientific operation, who was actually doing the backbreaking, miserable work of digging the gold out of the solid rock? It certainly was not the royal princes. The ancient texts reveal that the Anunnaki society, much like our own modern human societies, had a strict class hierarchy. Below the royal elite, there was a lower tier of beings, a working-class faction of alien astronauts. The Sumerians called them the Igigi. If the Anunnaki royals were the executives and the generals, the Igigi were the blue-collar workers, the grunts, and the enlisted soldiers of the expedition. They were the ones who had to put their boots in the mud. When Enlil decreed that the gold would be extracted from the deep subterranean veins of the Abzu, the region we now know as Southern Africa, it was the Igigi who were sent down into the darkness. Imagine, for a moment, the absolute horror of their situation. The Igigi were an advanced species. They had flown across the solar system in sophisticated spacecraft. Yet, upon arriving on this alien world, they were stripped of the glory of space exploration and forced into the role of primitive miners. They were sent deep into the crust of southeastern Africa, plunged into the suffocating, sweltering heat of the underground. They spent their days, which, due to their incredibly long lifespans stretched into thousands and thousands of Earth years, swinging heavy tools, breathing in toxic rock dust, and hauling massive loads of raw gold ore back to the surface. It was a literal subterranean hell. They were biological beings, not machines. They felt fatigue, they felt pain, and most dangerously of all, they felt a growing, burning resentment. Now, before we write this off as pure science fiction or fantasy, we need to pause and look at modern archaeology. Is there any physical evidence on Earth to support the idea that massive, organised mining operations were taking place in southern Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago? Astonishingly, the answer is yes. In the 1970s, the Anglo-American Corporation, a massive mining conglomerate, began digging new gold mines in South Africa and Swaziland. To the utter shock of their geologists, they did not find untouched rock. Instead, they stumbled upon dozens of ancient man-made mining shafts. Some of these ancient tunnels went down as far as 50 feet into the solid earth. When archaeologists were brought in to carbon date the artifacts, stone tools and charcoal found inside these ancient shafts, the results were completely baffling to orthodox history. The dates came back showing that these mines had been actively worked anywhere from 80,000 to over 100,000 years ago. According to the mainstream timeline of human evolution, humans living 100,000 years ago were primitive hunter-gatherers. They were supposed to be living in caves and hunting animals with basic spears. Why would a primitive, Stone Age human spend an immense amount of time, energy and calories digging 50 feet into solid rock to extract gold, a soft metal that is completely useless for making weapons or tools? Mainstream science often suggests they were mining for shiny ores like ochre to use in body paint. But alternative researchers point to the sheer, industrial scale of these ancient excavations and ask a different question. What if they were not the first ones digging there? What if these ancient African mines are the physical remnants of the Igigi's agonizing labour? Back in the ancient Sumerian narrative, the situation in the Abzu was reaching a boiling point. The Epic of Atrahasis, an incredible clay tablet that currently resides in the British Museum in London, describes the misery of the Igigi in vivid, heart-wrenching detail. The text states, "When the gods, like men, bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much. The Igigi had been mining for 40 shars. Bestmens. If one shar is equal to a 3,600-year orbit of Nibiru, that means the Igigi had been trapped in those sweltering African mines for over 140,000 Earth years. Their psychological breaking point finally arrived. The Igigi looked up from their dark, miserable holes and thought about Enlil. Enlil, the Lord of the Command, was sitting comfortably in his beautiful, newly built sanctuary in the city of Nippur, a place the Sumerians called the Eker. Enlil was enjoying the fresh air of Mesopotamia, eating the finest foods, and ruling as an absolute dictator, while they were dying in the dark to save a home planet they had not seen in over 100 millennia. The contrast was too much to bear. The whispers in the dark tunnels turned into shouts, and the shouts turned into a full-blown mutiny. What happened next is recorded in the ancient texts as the very first labour strike in the history of the world. But it was not a peaceful protest. The Igigi dropped their heavy baskets, they threw down their pickaxes. In a shocking act of defiance against the supreme crown of Nibiru, they set fire to their mining equipment. They burned their tools to ashes, completely halting the gold production that was keeping their home planet alive. By destroying their tools, the Igigi were essentially sending a message. We would rather let Nibiru burn than spend one more day in this subterranean nightmare. But they did not stop at simply refusing to work. A massive, angry mob of exhausted alien astronauts marched out of the African Abzu and travelled north toward the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia. Their target was Enlil. The Epic of Atrahasis describes the terrifying scene perfectly. It was the middle of the night. The city of Nippur was quiet and asleep. Suddenly the darkness was shattered by the blazing light of hundreds of torches. The Igigi had completely surrounded the Ekur, Enlil's heavily fortified compound. They brought their weapons, and they were shouting for the commander to come out and face them. Inside the compound, Enlil's guards were absolutely terrified. The gatekeeper ran to Enlil's private chambers and woke him up, warning him that a violent mob had surrounded the house and that they were fully prepared to breach the doors. Enlil, the strict, uncompromising military commander, was absolutely furious. He viewed this not as a labour dispute, but as high treason. His immediate reaction was to reach for his weapons. He wanted to violently crush the rebellion, execute the ringleaders, and force the survivors back into the mines at gunpoint, but his advisors warned him against it. The Igigi heavily outnumbered Enlil's personal guard. If a battle broke out, it would ignite a full-scale Anunnaki civil war on Earth, and if that happened, the gold mining operation would be permanently destroyed. Realizing he was completely cornered, Enlil used his communication devices to send an urgent planetary distress signal to his father, King Anu, who was either orbiting Earth in a command ship or receiving the message back on Nibiru. Enlil also summoned his brother, Enki, the scientist who had originally managed the African territories. When Anu and Enki arrived at the compound, a tense, high-stakes negotiation began. Anu, observing the angry mob, asked Enlil why his house was surrounded. Enlil, shaking with rage, demanded that Anu authorize lethal force to put down the rebellion. But King Anu was a wiser, more pragmatic ruler. He demanded to hear directly from the Igigi. The Igigi stepped forward and poured out their grievances. The ancient texts record their plea. Every single one of us gods has declared war. We have set our unexcavated labour in the fire. The excessive toil has killed us. Our work was heavy, the distress much. Anu listened to the exhausted, soot-covered workers, and much to Enlil's disgust, Anu completely agreed with them. He looked at his sons and stated that the complaints of the Igigi were entirely justified. The labour was simply too heavy, the conditions too brutal, and the time spent in the dark too agonising for any biological being to endure indefinitely. Anu issued a royal decree. The Igigi would not be punished for their mutiny, and they were officially relieved of their mining duties. They would never be forced back into the subterranean depths of the Abzu again. While this decision prevented a bloody civil war, it immediately created a catastrophic problem. The strike was resolved, but the core issue remained completely unsolved. The atmosphere on Nibiru was still deteriorating. The gold shield was still incomplete. They absolutely needed the gold from the deep veins of Africa, but now they had no one willing to dig it out. The entire survival mission of the Anunnaki species had just hit a massive, impenetrable brick wall. They could not abandon the Earth, but they could not extract its resources. The Council of the Gods sat in stunned, desperate silence. Enlil had no answers. You cannot arrest and execute a problem like this. Anu had no answers. A king's decree cannot make gold levitate out of the rock. The survival of their entire race hung by a thread. It was in this moment of absolute despair that Enki, the brilliant, unorthodox geneticist, the Lord of the Earth, stood up in the council chamber. He looked at his angry brother, his weary father, and the exhausted Igigi, and he smiled. Enki announced that he had a solution. They did not need to abandon the gold, and they did not need the Igigi to mine it. Enki proposed something so radical, so scientifically audacious, and so ethically terrifying that it would forever alter the history of the Earth. He told the council, while the birth goddess is present, let her create a primitive worker. Let him bear the yoke. Let him carry the toil of the gods. Enki was not going to build a machine to mine the gold. He was going to build a brand new biological species. He was going to play God, and his grand experiment was going to be us. The Grand Council of the Anunnaki was in a state of absolute paralysed shock. The Igigi, the exhausted working-class astronauts, had successfully mutinied, burned their tools, and effectively shut down the massive gold mining operation in southern Africa. Without that gold, the atmospheric shield on their home planet of Nibiru would fail entirely, and their entire species would face extinction. Yet King Anu had just pardoned the mutineers, declaring that no Anunnaki would ever be forced into those dark subterranean depths again. They were trapped in an impossible paradox. It was in this suffocating silence that Enki, the brilliant chief scientist and lord of the earth, stood up and delivered a proposal that would echo through eternity. He declared that the gold mining did not have to stop, nor did they need to build complex robotic machines to replace the Igigi. Instead, he proposed something far more radical. He told the council, let us create a primitive worker. Let him bear the yoke. Let him carry the toil of the gods. But how could they possibly create a brand new biological workforce out of thin air? Enki's genius lay in his deep observation of the Earth. During his time managing the wild territories of the Abzu in Africa, he had been studying the local fauna. He noticed a particular species of wild hominid creatures roaming the African savannas. To modern science, we might call them Homo erectus or a similar early hominid ancestor. These creatures were adapted to the harsh Earth environment. They walked upright and they had hands capable of grasping objects. However, they were wild animals. They possessed no advanced intellect, no complex language, and absolutely no ability to follow the intricate, structured commands required to operate a deep underground mining facility. Enki's pitch to the council was not to create life from absolute scratch, but to hijack the natural evolutionary process of the Earth. He explained that the base model already existed. All they needed to do was bind the image of the gods upon it. They needed to take this wild, primitive ape man and artificially upgrade its intellect by splicing it with Anunnaki genetics. This concept is profoundly fascinating because it seamlessly bridges one of the greatest ideological divides in modern human history: the war between Darwinian evolution and religious creationism. For centuries, modern humans have argued. Did we slowly evolve from apes over millions of years through natural selection? Or were we suddenly and miraculously created by a divine being in a single moment? According to the ancient Sumerian tablets, the answer is both. Evolution is a real, natural process that produced the early hominids, but the sudden, inexplicable leap in cognitive ability, the massive overnight explosion in human brain capacity that still puzzles modern anthropologists today, was the result of a deliberate artificial genetic intervention by the Anunnaki. To execute this unprecedented project, Enki called upon his half-sister, Ninhursag. In the Anunnaki hierarchy, Ninhursag was not a military leader or a politician. She was the chief medical officer. She was a master biologist and geneticist. Together, they established a specialized laboratory in the heart of the African Abzu, a place the ancient texts refer to as the House of Life. When we read the ancient Mesopotamian creation epics, the language used to describe the creation of mankind is heavily shrouded in myth and metaphor. The most famous and pervasive metaphor, one that was later adopted by Judaism, Christianity and Islam, is the story of a creator god taking the clay, or the dust of the earth, breathing life into it, and forming the first human being. To a primitive mind, this sounds like a magical potter making a statue come to life. But if we put on our modern scientific lenses and reread the original Sumerian texts, a staggering, high-tech reality emerges. In the ancient Sumerian language, the word used for clay is teat. However, Sumerian is a deeply complex polysemous language, meaning words often have multiple, layered meanings. Teat translates to clay or mud, but its older, root meaning is that which is with life. In certain contexts, it was used to describe an egg. Furthermore, the texts state that this clay had to be mixed with the blood and the essence of an Anunnaki god. Let us translate this ancient poetry into modern biology. Enki and Ninhursag were not playing with mud. They were conducting in vitro fertilization, OVF, and DNA splicing. The clay of the earth represents the earthly genetic material, specifically an ovum or an egg extracted from a female earth hominid. The ape woman, the blood and essence of the gods, represents the highly advanced extraterrestrial DNA extracted from an Anunnaki male. By splicing the Anunnaki DNA into the hominid egg, they were attempting to create a perfect hybrid, a creature with the physical resilience to survive the harsh earth environment, but with just enough Anunnaki intellect to understand language, hold a pickaxe, and follow orders. However, science is rarely perfect on the first try, and the Sumerian texts are astonishingly honest about this. Unlike the biblical narrative where God creates a perfect human flawlessly on the very first day, the Anunnaki genetic project was plagued with horrific failures and tragic errors. The ancient tablets record a period of intense trial and error in the House of Life. The texts describe a scene where Enki and Ninhursag, exhausted but excited by their initial progress, celebrate by drinking heavily. In their intoxicated state, they begin mixing the genetic materials haphazardly. The results were disastrous. The tablets describe the birth of various deformed beings, humans born with paralyzed hands, humans with twisted spines, humans without reproductive organs, and beings suffering from blindness. Instead of hiding these failures, the texts detail how Ninhursag tried to find a place for these disabled creatures in their society, showing a bizarre mix of divine power and profound biological vulnerability. It proves that they were not omnipotent magical gods. They were fallible, physical scientists running an experimental laboratory. Eventually, the alcohol wore off, the methodology was perfected, and they achieved a breakthrough. They successfully fertilized a hybrid embryo that was genetically stable, but an embryo needs a womb to gestate. They could not place the hybrid embryo back into the wild ape woman, as the Anunnaki genetics made the fetal skull too large for a primitive hominid to deliver safely. So, Ninhursag herself, the chief medical officer, volunteered to be the very first surrogate mother for humanity. The texts describe the agonizing wait. Enki and the assistants counted the months, matching the gestation period of the Anunnaki. When the time came, Ninhursag went into labour. It was a difficult birth, requiring what modern medicine would recognise as a surgical intervention or a primitive caesarean section. But when the crying infant was finally held up, Enki shouted in triumph, "I have created it! My hands have made it!" They called this perfect, successful prototype Adamu. In the ancient languages of the region, Adamu roughly translates to he of the earth, or the one made of dark red soil. He was the very first true human being, the first Homo sapiens. He was not a king, nor a friend of the gods. In the eyes of the Anunnaki, Adamu was a Lulu, a term meaning the mixed one, or more brutally, a primitive worker. He was a highly advanced biological tool designed entirely for servitude. The physical appearance of Adamu was a stark contrast to his creators. The texts hint that the Anunnaki were incredibly tall, perhaps standing 8 to 10 feet in height, with pale skin and distinct facial features adapted to the environment of Nibiru. Adamu was smaller, robust, with dark hair and skin suited for the blazing African sun. But most importantly, when Enki looked into the eyes of Adamu, he saw the spark of consciousness. Adamu could learn. He could understand commands. The experiment was a resounding success. However, Adamu was not going to mine millions of tons of gold. They needed an absolute army of workers. Since the genetic template was now perfected, they moved to mass production. The Anunnaki gathered 14 young birth goddesses, female Anunnaki medical staff, to act as surrogate mothers. They implanted 7 male embryos and 7 female embryos into these women. For a time, this was how the human race was propagated. Assembled in a lab and gestated in the wombs of alien nurses, the newly born humans were immediately put to work. They were sent down into the dark, terrifying depths of the African Abzu, taking over the pickaxes and the baskets that the Igigi had abandoned. The gold began to flow again. The atmospheric crisis on Nibiru was slowly being stabilized. Enlil was satisfied, and the Great Rebellion was put to rest. But a glaring, fundamental flaw in Enki's manufacturing process soon became obvious. The human workers were dying faster than the Anunnaki females could birth them. Mining is a highly dangerous, lethal profession, and the humans possessed relatively short lifespans compared to the near-immortal Anunnaki. Furthermore, asking the female Anunnaki elite to act as permanent, continuous breeding machines for a slave race was degrading and completely unsustainable. The problem was that the first generation of humans, like many genetic hybrids found in nature, were completely sterile. If you breed a male donkey with a female horse, you get a mule. The mule is strong, intelligent, and an incredible worker, but it is genetically incapable of reproducing. The Lulu workers were essentially biological mules. They could not breed among themselves. Enki realized he had to perform a second, highly controversial genetic upgrade. He needed to alter the human DNA so that the workers could procreate on their own, essentially taking the burden of reproduction off the Anunnaki and allowing the human slaves to organically manufacture their own replacements. This brings us to one of the most famous and misunderstood stories in human history, the creation of Eve from the rib of Adam. When we look at the Sumerian root words, the word Tai translates as both rib and life. When the ancient story was translated into Hebrew centuries later, the translators chose the word rib, creating the bizarre image of God pulling a physical bone out of a sleeping man's chest. But modern scholars suggest a much more profound translation. What Enki extracted from the sleeping Adamu was not a bone, but his life essence, his DNA, his chromosomal structure. Enki manipulated the sex chromosomes, splitting the X and Y, to perfectly engineer a female counterpart capable of sexual reproduction. Once this secondary upgrade was complete, the humans were given the ability to know each other biologically. This is famously echoed in the biblical allegory of the Tree of Knowledge. The knowledge they acquired was not math or physics, it was the knowledge of biological reproduction. Some of these new upgraded humans were transported out of the harsh African mines and brought north to Mesopotamia. Enlil needed servants to tend to his magnificent gardens, to manage the agricultural fields and to serve food in the Anunnaki temples. The Sumerian name for this lush, irrigated, protective enclosure where the gods lived and the humans served was Idin, pronounced Edin, meaning the abode of the righteous ones. It was here, in the Mesopotamian East, Din, the original Garden of Eden, that humanity experienced its first massive population explosion. Freed from the confines of the laboratory and possessing the ability to multiply, the human workforce grew at an exponential, terrifying rate. They spread across the land, tilling the soil, digging the canals and building the foundations of human civilization under the watchful, demanding eyes of their extraterrestrial masters. Enki had successfully saved his species. He had created the perfect biological machine. But by giving humanity the ability to reproduce, he had unleashed a force that could not be put back into a test tube. The humans were no longer just a handful of laboratory curiosities. They were becoming a massive, thriving species of their own. And as their numbers multiplied into the tens of thousands, their chaotic, noisy, and rapidly evolving nature would soon bring them into direct, catastrophic conflict with the supreme commander of Earth, Enlil. The age of the human slave had begun, but the ultimate test of their survival was still to come. As the human population exploded, the dynamic between the creators and their creations began to fundamentally shift. Humanity was no longer confined to the dark, sweltering depths of the African gold mines. While a massive workforce still remained in the Abzu to keep the precious gold flowing toward Nibiru, a significant portion of the human population had been relocated north to the lush, fertile crescent of Mesopotamia. Here, under the direct supervision of Enlil and the Anunnaki elite, humanity was about to experience its second great leap forward. They were about to transition from being primitive, underground mining slaves into the builders and managers of the world's very first civilization. To understand this transition, we have to look at the sudden, inexplicable agricultural revolution that occurred in the ancient Middle East. For hundreds of thousands of years, early hominids and early humans were strictly hunter-gatherers. They relied entirely on whatever nature provided. But suddenly, seemingly overnight in the historical record, the Sumerians began planting vast fields of domesticated wheat and barley. They dug massive, complex irrigation canals to divert the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They domesticated wild animals, corralling sheep and cattle for a steady supply of wool, milk, and meat. Traditional history attributes this sudden burst of ingenuity to natural human progression. But the ancient Sumerian clay tablets tell a very different story. They explicitly state that agriculture and animal husbandry were not invented by humans. They were gifts handed down from the heavens. They were technologies taught to humanity by the Anunnaki. The gods realized that if they were going to have a massive human workforce living in Mesopotamia, those workers needed to be fed. And the Anunnaki certainly were not going to toil in the muddy fields themselves to feed their slaves. Therefore they taught humans the science of agriculture. They elevated certain, more intelligent humans out of the mud and gave them a new title, the servants of the gods. These elevated humans became the first foremen, the first priests and the first kings. Their job was to act as middle management. They received orders directly from the Anunnaki and then commanded the masses of human labourers to execute those orders. This brings us to one of the most awe-inspiring and misunderstood architectural achievements of the ancient world, the ziggurat. As the human population grew, the Anunnaki demanded grander, more permanent settlements. They ordered the humans to build massive, sprawling megacities like Ur, Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur. And at the absolute centre of every single one of these ancient cities stood a ziggurat. If you look at pictures of ancient Mesopotamian ruins today, a ziggurat looks like a massive stepped pyramid made of baked mud bricks. To traditional archaeologists, these structures were simply primitive temples, where superstitious people went to pray to imaginary sky gods. But if we view the Anunnaki not as mythical spirits, but as physical, technologically advanced extraterrestrials, the purpose of the ziggurat changes entirely. The Sumerian texts never describe the ziggurats as places of silent spiritual worship. They refer to them as the literal houses or residences of the gods. A ziggurat was a heavily fortified multi-purpose command centre. The lower level served as massive administrative hubs and grain silos, where the human workers would bring their agricultural offerings to be stored and distributed. The middle levels housed the human priests, the middle managers who kept the city running. But the very top of the ziggurat, the highest platform reaching into the sky, was strictly off limits to normal humans. This upper sanctum was heavily guarded and reserved exclusively for the residing Anunnaki commander. Why build them so high? If the Anunnaki were using flying vehicles as the texts frequently describe, these towering flat-topped structures would have served as perfect elevated landing pads, keeping the roaring engines and dangerous exhaust of their sky chariots safely away from the crowded human city below. Furthermore, in an era before modern telecommunications, a massive tower in the centre of a flat, open plain is the ideal location for a communication relay station, allowing the various Anunnaki leaders to coordinate their operations across the globe and communicate with their spacecraft in orbit. The humans provided the back-breaking labour, baking millions of bricks in the scorching sun and hauling them up massive ramps, all to construct these towering extraterrestrial airports. But as the cities grew and the ziggurats pierced the sky, a new, highly controversial dynamic began to unfold. For the first time in history, humans and their alien creators were living side by side in densely populated urban centres. The Anunnaki were not invisible spirits. They were physical, biological beings. They had physical desires, physical needs, and a deeply ingrained biology. And as they walked among the thriving, vibrant human population, the strict professional boundary between master and slave began to completely break down. This breakdown is recorded in one of the most famous, yet deeply mysterious passages in human religious text. In the Bible, the book of Genesis chapter 6, there is a bizarre, seemingly out-of-place paragraph that has baffled theologians for centuries. It reads, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose." The text goes on to say, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." For a long time, traditional churches struggled to explain this passage. How could angels, which are supposed to be ethereal, sexless spirits, physically mate with human women? It makes absolutely no biological sense. But if we read this exact same story through the lens of the much older Sumerian texts, the mystery instantly evaporates into a shocking biological reality. The sons of God were not magical angels. They were the male Anunnaki, and specifically the younger, restless generation of the Igigi, who had come down from the space stations or the mining colonies. The daughters of humans were the female descendants of the very workers Enki and Ninhursag had genetically engineered in the lab. Because humanity was created using Anunnaki DNA, because we were made in their genetic image, our two species were genetically compatible. When the male Anunnaki looked upon the human women, they saw creatures that looked remarkably like themselves, and they began to take them as wives and concubines. This was an unauthorized, massive crossbreeding event. The offspring of these physical unions were the legendary Nephilim. The word Nephilim is often translated as giants or the fallen ones. Physically, these hybrid children were terrifyingly impressive. They inherited the earthly resilience of their human mothers, but they also inherited the dominant extraterrestrial genetics of their Anunnaki fathers. This meant they grew to massive, towering heights, far larger than normal humans. They possessed immense physical strength and vastly extended lifespans, living for hundreds of years, though not as long as the pure-blooded Anunnaki. These Nephilim demigods quickly rose to power within the ancient world. Because they held the literal blood of the gods in their veins, they were elevated to the status of kings, warlords, and the heroes of old. If you want a perfect, historically documented example of this, look no further than the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written story on Earth. The Sumerian texts explicitly state that King Gilgamesh was not a normal man. He was mathematically described as being 2/3 god and 1/3 human. He was a giant of immense strength who ruled the city of Uruk with an iron fist. The ancient world was suddenly ruled by a race of giant hybrid demigods who sat on the thrones of the newly built human cities, while Enki, the original creator of humanity, might have looked upon this crossbreeding with scientific curiosity or even quiet amusement. There was one being who viewed it with absolute unbridled disgust. Enlil, the Lord of the Command, was furious. To Enlil, the Earth mission was a strict professional military and mining operation. The humans were supposed to be nothing more than biological tools, mindless machines designed to dig gold and serve food. But now, the tools were reproducing out of control. They were swarming across the planet. They were loud. They were chaotic. And worst of all, they were polluting the pure, royal, extraterrestrial bloodline of the Anunnaki. Enlil viewed the Nephilim not as glorious heroes, but as abominations, a grotesque violation of the natural cosmic order. The Sumerian texts describe Enlil's growing psychological breaking point. The Epic of Atrahasis records his complaints to the Grand Council of the Gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I'm deprived of sleep. So, Enlil was not just talking about the physical noise of human cities. He was talking about the chaos, the rebellion, and the unpredictable nature of a rapidly evolving, genetically hybridized species. Humanity was no longer a docile workforce. They were building armies, fighting wars among themselves, and acting with a terrifying level of independence. The experiment had completely escaped the laboratory. Enlil decided that enough was enough. The human population had become a cancerous tumour on the Earth operation, and it needed to be surgically removed. He began looking for a way to exterminate his brother's creation. He tried sending plagues, diseases, and localized famines to thin out the human herds, but Enki, feeling a deep paternal love for his creations, always found a way to secretly teach humans how to survive, how to find medicinal herbs, and how to store grain. Enlil realized that localized punishments were not going to work. If he wanted to solve the human problem once and for all, he needed a global, apocalyptic extinction event. He needed to wipe the slate entirely clean. And as he looked up into the heavens, charting the movement of the stars and the planets, he realized that the perfect, unstoppable weapon was rapidly approaching the Earth. It was not a weapon made of lasers or nuclear fire. It was the terrifying, undeniable force of planetary gravity, and it was going to unleash an ocean of death upon the world. The grand experiment had spiraled entirely out of control. To understand the sheer magnitude of the crisis unfolding on Earth, we must put ourselves in the mind of Enlil, the supreme military commander of the Anunnaki. When he had first arrived on this planet, Earth was a quiet, pristine, and orderly world. The mission was straightforward: extract the gold, save the home planet of Nibiru, and maintain absolute discipline. But now, as he looked down from his magnificent elevated ziggurat in the city of Nipper, all he saw was chaos. The human workforce, originally designed to be a small, easily managed population of sterile biological machines, had become a sprawling, rapidly multiplying plague. In the ancient epic of Atrahasis, Enlil's frustration is famously summarized in a single terrifying complaint. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I'm deprived of sleep. For a long time, historians took this line literally, assuming that ancient humans were simply throwing loud parties or crying out in the streets, annoying a grumpy, mythical sky god. But when we analyse this text through the lens of a massive extraterrestrial colonial operation, the word noise takes on a much darker and more complex meaning. This noise was not just acoustic volume, it was the suffocating weight of an exploding population. It was the frantic, unpredictable energy of a species that was evolving too fast. Humans were demanding more land, consuming massive amounts of food and spreading diseases. They were forming their own complex tribal alliances, fighting bloody territorial wars with one another, and constantly rebelling against the strict, orderly schedules imposed by their Anunnaki overseers. Furthermore, the presence of the Nephilim, the giant hybrid demigods born from the unauthorized breeding between the Anunnaki workers and human women, had completely corrupted the chain of command. These giant offspring were leading human armies, challenging the authority of the pure-blooded Anunnaki elite, and turning the Earth into a loud, violent, and utterly unmanageable war zone. Enlil's hatred for humanity reached a boiling point. He viewed humans as a failed, dangerous biological weapon that had escaped the laboratory and was now destroying the very fabric of the Earth colony. He decided that the human species had to be violently pruned, if not entirely exterminated. Long before the concept of a global flood even entered his mind, Enlil attempted to use conventional environmental warfare to wipe out the human pests. The ancient texts record that Enlil deliberately engineered massive, localized catastrophes. He ordered the Anunnaki weather controllers to withhold the rains, causing horrific, multi-year droughts that dried up the rivers and withered the crops. When the humans did not die off fast enough from starvation, he unleashed biological warfare, spreading devastating plagues and deadly diseases through the densely populated human cities. It was a systematic, ruthless campaign of genocide designed to break the human spirit and reduce their numbers to zero. But every single time Enlil unleashed a new horror upon the world, humanity miraculously survived. The crops would eventually grow back, the sick would mysteriously heal, and the population would bounce back stronger than before. Enlil was furious and utterly baffled. How were these primitive, fragile creatures surviving his highly calculated, divine punishments? The answer, hidden in the shadows, was his brother, Enki. Enki, the brilliant geneticist who had created humanity, harboured a deep, profound, almost paternal love for his creations. While Enlil saw humans as a biological mistake, Enki saw them as his ultimate scientific masterpiece. Every time Enlil decreed a drought, Enki would secretly sneak down to the human cities and teach them how to dig deeper wells and build advanced irrigation canals to tap into the subterranean aquifers. When Enlil unleashed a plague, Enki would visit the human priests in the dead of night, teaching them the secrets of medicinal herbs, ancient pharmacology, and sanitation. Enki was effectively running a massive underground resistance movement against his own brother, constantly sabotaging the Supreme Commander's efforts to destroy humanity. Enlil soon realized that as long as Enki was secretly interfering, localized punishments like famines and plagues would never work. If he truly wanted to cleanse the earth of the human infestation and wipe out the Nephilim hybrids, he needed something absolute. He needed an extinction-level event so massive, so sudden, and so overwhelmingly destructive that not even Enki's brilliant science could save them. And as Enlil looked to the heavens, mapping the complex mathematics of the solar system, he realized that the perfect weapon was already hurtling toward them through the dark void of space. It was not a weapon built in a laboratory, it was the terrifying, unstoppable force of celestial mechanics. The rogue planet Nibiru was making its return journey. To understand the mechanics of the ancient apocalypse, we have to look at the intersection of Anunnaki astronomy and the geological history of the Earth. Nibiru, the massive home planet of the Anunnaki, was on its vast 3,600-year elliptical orbit. It was swinging back from the deep freeze of outer space, accelerating violently as it was pulled by the immense gravitational force of the Sun. But this particular crossing was going to be different. The Anunnaki astronomers realized that the orbital paths were aligning in a highly dangerous configuration. Nibiru was going to pass incredibly close to the Earth. when a planetary body of massive size and density passes close to another planet, the gravitational effects are devastating. We can understand this through a very simple everyday phenomenon: the tides of our oceans. The Earth's moon, which is relatively small, possesses enough gravitational pull to drag billions of gallons of ocean water back and forth across our coastlines every single day. Now imagine replacing that small, gentle moon with a massive, roaring, density-packed planet hurtling through the inner solar system. The gravitational pull of Nibiru would not just pull on the water, it would pull on the very tectonic plates of the Earth itself. But the real danger was not just the shifting tectonic plates, it was the ice. According to both ancient Sumerian texts and modern geological records, this event coincided perfectly with the end of the last great ice age on Earth, roughly 12,000 years ago. During this period, the continent of Antarctica, located at the southern pole of the Earth, was not just covered in a thin layer of snow, it was buried under a staggering miles-thick sheet of solid, unimaginably heavy ice. The Anunnaki scientists monitoring the planet from their orbital stations noticed something terrifying happening to this massive Antarctic ice sheet. The Earth was already undergoing a natural warming period, causing the bottom layer of the ice, the part grinding against the bedrock of the continent, to slowly melt. This created a highly unstable, slippery layer of slush and water beneath billions of tons of solid ice. The entire ice shelf was precariously balanced, essentially hovering on a slippery slide of mud and water, just waiting for a push. Enlil realized exactly what was going to happen when Nibiru flew past the Earth. The massive gravitational tractor beam of the approaching planet would pull violently on the unstable, miles-thick ice sheet of Antarctica. The gravitational force would violently rip the entire ice shelf off the bedrock and send it crashing directly into the southern oceans in one massive, catastrophic piece. To visualize the horrific result of this, imagine dropping a massive, heavy brick into a bathtub full of water. The sudden displacement of water forces a massive wave to rise and crash over the sides of the tub. Now, scale that up to a planetary level. When billions of tons of solid ice slammed into the southern oceans, it would displace the water so violently that it would create a global mega tsunami. A wall of water miles high would rise from the south, roaring northward at the speed of a jet airliner. It would instantly swallow the coastlines, sweep over the plains, and completely submerge the great mountains of the Earth. It would be a total, instantaneous, and inescapable cleansing of the globe. For Enlil, this was the ultimate revelation. It was the perfect alibi. He did not need to launch a single weapon. He did not need to order his soldiers to slaughter the humans. He simply needed to let nature take its terrifying course. Because this was a natural celestial event, Enki could not blame him for the destruction. The Earth itself was going to execute the human race, and Enlil merely had to sit back and watch. However, Enlil knew that if the humans were given even a few days of warning, they might find a way to survive. They might run to the highest peaks, build massive rafts, or hide in deep, fortified caves. He needed absolute total secrecy. He needed to ensure that humanity was caught completely off guard by the roaring wall of water. Enlil immediately summoned the Grand Council of the Anunnaki. He called his father, King Anu, his sister, Ninhursag, and most importantly, his brother, Enki. They gathered in the High Command Center, surrounded by the flashing lights of their astronomical tracking equipment. Enlil projected the data for all of them to see. He showed them the incoming trajectory of Nibiru. He showed them the unstable ice sheet in the south. He laid out the terrifying mathematics of the impending mega tsunami. The Earth was doomed. The grand Mesopotamian cities they had built, Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, would all be wiped off the face of the planet in a matter of hours. The Anunnaki Council was struck with horror. Ninhursag, the mother of humanity, wept openly at the thought of her creations drowning in the dark waters. Enki was absolutely paralyzed with grief and rage. He argued fiercely, begging the council to launch a massive rescue operation, to use their sky chariots to lift the human populations to safety, or at least to warn them to build shelters. But Enlil slammed his fist down on the command table. He declared that this was divine natural cleansing. The humans had become a plague, the Nephilim had corrupted the earth, and the impending flood was the universe's way of restoring order. He issued a supreme martial decree. The Anunnaki would immediately begin evacuating. They would load their most vital equipment, their records, and their royal personnel into their spacecraft and retreat into the high orbit of the Earth, waiting out the disaster in space. But Enlil did not stop there. He knew Enki's rebellious nature. He knew that Enki would immediately rush out of the command center to warn his beloved human creations. Enlil turned to his brother and demanded something absolutely unthinkable. By the supreme authority of King Anu and the ancient laws of Nibiru, Enlil forced the entire council, and specifically targeted Enki, to swear a sacred, binding oath of absolute silence. They were forbidden, under the penalty of high treason and immediate execution, from speaking a single word of the impending doom to any human being. Enki was trapped. The political pressure was insurmountable. With his father, the king, watching him, and the rigid laws of his people binding him, Enki slowly raised his hand and swore the oath. He promised not to tell mankind about the flood. Enlil smiled, satisfied that the trap was perfectly set. The fate of humanity was officially sealed. Down below, on the surface of the earth, the humans went about their daily lives, completely oblivious to the cosmic drama unfolding above their heads. But the signs of the approaching doom were already beginning to manifest. The sky, once a brilliant blue, began to take on a terrifying, bruised, reddish hue as the magnetic field of the Earth warped under the pressure of the approaching rogue planet. Strange, howling winds swept through the valleys. The animals grew restless, fleeing the plains in a state of absolute panic. Deep underground, the tectonic plates groaned and shuddered, sending violent tremors through the foundations of the mighty ziggurats. In the high orbital stations, the Anunnaki strapped themselves into their command chairs, watching the terrifyingly beautiful approach of Nibiru on their monitors. The countdown to the end of the world had begun. The great silence of the gods had descended upon the earth. But Enki, the master of science, the lord of water, and the eternal rebel, was not a being who surrendered easily. He had sworn an oath not to speak to any human, but his brilliant mind was already racing, searching for a loophole in the divine law. He was about to perform the greatest act of betrayal in the history of the Anunnaki, a desperate whispered secret that would give birth to the most enduring survival story in the history of the world. The countdown to the apocalypse was ticking away, and Enki, the brilliant Anunnaki scientist who had engineered the human race, found himself trapped in an impossible dilemma. He had stood before the grand council of the gods with his father, King Anu, and his ruthless brother Enlil staring him down. Under immense political pressure and the threat of execution for high treason, Enki had sworn a sacred, binding oath. He had promised not to warn a single human being about the impending mega tsunami that was about to wipe all life off the face of the earth. To break this oath meant an instant death sentence and a full-scale Anunnaki civil war. But to keep the oath meant watching his greatest biological masterpiece, the human race, drown in the dark, freezing waters. Enki, however, was not just a master of genetics. He was the god of wisdom, and he possessed a cunning, rebellious mind. He realized that the strict legal wording of his oath forbade him from speaking directly to a human. But it did not forbid him from speaking to an inanimate object. Under the cover of night, as the earth began to tremble from the gravitational pull of the approaching rogue planet Nibiru, Enki slipped out of the Anunnaki command center. He traveled to the ancient Sumerian city of Shuruppak, navigating through the dark, sleeping streets until he found the humble home of a man named Zeusudra. In later Akkadian texts, this man is called Utnapishtim, and thousands of years later in the Hebrew Bible he would be known to the world as Noah. Utnapishtim was not a king or a giant Nephilim warlord. He was a devout, intelligent and fiercely loyal servant of Enki. As Utnapishtim slept inside his house, which was constructed of woven river reeds, Enki stood outside the wall. Instead of waking the man, Enki leaned in close to the woven reeds and began to loudly whisper a terrifying warning. The ancient Mesopotamian tablets record his exact words perfectly. Enki whispered, read wall, listen to my words. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon your possessions and seek your life. Forsake your worldly goods and keep your soul alive. Aboard the boat take the seed of all living things. Utnapishtim awoke in terror, hearing the booming voice of his god echoing through the walls of his house. Enki, still speaking technically to the wall, proceeded to give Utnapishtim exact, mathematically precise blueprints for a survival vessel, but this vessel was absolutely nothing like the classic wooden houseboat often depicted in modern children's books about Noah's Ark. Enki knew that a standard open-decked boat would be instantly pulverized by a miles-high mega tsunami. Instead, the ancient texts describe a highly advanced, fully enclosed submersible craft. Enki instructed Utnapishtim to build a massive cube-like vessel, heavily reinforced with wooden ribs. Most importantly, it had to be completely sealed. Enki ordered him to melt massive amounts of pitch and debitumen, natural asphalt that bubbled up from the Iraqi desert, and slather it over every single inch of the vessel, both inside and out. It had to be entirely watertight, functioning more like an ancient submarine designed to violently tumble and roll beneath massive crashing waves, rather than float gently on top of them. Next came the cargo. The traditional story tells us that Noah marched 2 of every animal on Earth into his wooden boat. From a purely biological and logistical standpoint, this is completely impossible. A single boat cannot hold millions of species, nor can it provide the specific climates, diets and habitats required to keep them alive. But the Sumerian texts offer a fascinating high-tech alternative. Enki told Utnapishtim to gather the seed of all living things. If we view Enki as a master geneticist, the seed of life does not mean fully grown living animals. It means genetic material, DNA samples, vials of reproductive cells gathered from the Anunnaki's House of Life laboratories. Utnapishtim was not building a floating zoo. He was building a watertight vault for a massive genetic repository, remarkably similar to the modern Svalbard Global Seed Vault hidden in the ice of Norway today. Along with these genetic samples, Utnapishtim brought his immediate family, a group of skilled craftsmen to help rebuild civilization, and enough provisions to survive a prolonged period of utter devastation. As Utnapishtim frantically sealed the final heavy hatch of his blackened submersible cube, the wrath of the heavens finally broke. Up in orbit, the Anunnaki had evacuated. They sat safely in their command ships, looking down at the beautiful blue and green sphere of the Earth. As the massive rogue planet Nibiru swung past, its terrifying gravitational tractor beam locked onto the Earth, the ancient texts described the sky turning pitch black in the middle of the day. A terrifying, roaring noise echoed across the globe, louder than any thunder ever heard. Deep in the south, the unthinkable happened. The miles-thick, colossal ice sheet of Antarctica fractured. With an earth-shattering crack, millions of square miles of solid ice violently detached from the bedrock and plunged directly into the southern oceans. The displacement of water was apocalyptic. A global mega-tsunami, a wall of water stretching into the clouds, rose from the south. It roared northward at the speed of a jet airliner, utterly merciless in its path. It instantly swallowed the coastlines, obliterated the massive mud-brick megacities of the Anunnaki, and completely submerged the towering ziggurats. The Earth was plunged into an absolute churning chaos of mud, water and death. Up in the orbital spacecraft, the reaction of the gods was not one of cold, calculating victory. The texts explicitly state that the Anunnaki were horrified by the sheer scale of the destruction they had unleashed. They had severely underestimated the terrifying power of the cosmic forces. Ninhur Sag, the Anunnaki medical officer who had been the surrogate mother to the very first human, broke down in hysterical tears. The ancient tablets record her agonizing cries as she looked down at the swirling brown waters. "My creatures have turned to clay. They fill the sea like dragonflies." Even the hardened Anunnaki soldiers wept, terrified by the fury of the storm. We must pause here to address a profound horizontal reality about this story. If you possess no background in ancient history, you might be thinking, wait, this is just the biblical story of Noah's Ark, but with alien names. You're absolutely correct, but the timeline is the key to the mystery. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the Epic of Atrahasis, which contain these exact Sumerian flood narratives, were written on clay tablets thousands of years before the first words of the Hebrew Bible were ever penned. The authors of the Bible, writing during the Babylonian exile, took the original historical Sumerian records of Enlil and Enki, removed the complex extraterrestrial politics, and condensed the two brothers into a single monotheistic god who both causes the flood and saves the hero. But the mystery goes much deeper than just the Middle East. If you travel across the globe, you will find that virtually every single ancient culture possesses a terrifyingly similar memory of a catastrophic, world-ending flood. In ancient Hindu scriptures, we find the story of a man named Manu. He is warned of an impending, world-destroying deluge by a giant fish, an avatar of the god Vishnu, who instructs him to build a massive boat and gather the seeds of life. In ancient Greek mythology, the god Zeus decides to exterminate a corrupted, violent generation of humanity with a massive flood. But the titan Prometheus, who, much like Enki, was a rebel god who loved humanity and gave them knowledge, secretly warns a man named Deucalion to construct a chest to survive the waters. Even in the rich folklore of Vietnam, we see echoes of this aquatic apocalypse in the legendary battle between Son Tin, the mountain lord, and Tui Tin, the water lord. Driven by intense jealousy and wrath, Tui Tin summons devastating storms and raises the floodwaters all the way to the towering peaks of the mountains, attempting to drown the world in his fury, forcing humanity to battle the rising tides to survive. Anthropologists have documented over 500 distinct flood myths from indigenous tribes in North America, deep in the Amazon rainforest, across the islands of Polynesia and throughout Asia. How is it possible that cultures completely isolated from one another by massive oceans all invented the exact same story about an angry deity wiping out the world with water, while a chosen survivor builds a boat? To modern science, this ubiquity is not a coincidence, nor is it mass hallucination. It points directly to a real, terrifying and globally shared trauma. Geologists refer to a period roughly 11,600 years ago as the end of the Younger Dryas. It was the sudden, violent end of the last ice age. Ice cores and geological strata prove that during this specific window of time, the Earth experienced massive, rapid spikes in sea levels, known as meltwater pulses. Millions of cubic miles of glacial ice melted or collapsed into the oceans, causing massive flooding across the planet, wiping out coastal settlements and severely bottlenecking the human population. The Anunnaki texts are simply the oldest, most detailed, and most technologically descriptive eyewitness accounts of a very real geological nightmare. Back in the Sumerian narrative, the violent storm raged for 7 days and 7 nights. Utnapishtim's pitch-black submersible was battered, tossed, and thrown through the turbulent waters. But the brilliant engineering of Enki held strong. The hull did not breach. Eventually, the roaring winds died down. The waters began to calm, settling into a vast, silent, endless ocean covering what used to be the cradle of civilization. Inside the dark, suffocating vessel, Utnapishtim felt a sudden, massive jolt. The boat had ground to a halt. It had not landed on a beach. The waters were far too high. It had run aground on the submerged peak of a massive mountain. The ancient texts, matching the biblical account perfectly, identify this location as the peaks of Mount Ararat, located in the rugged highlands of modern-day Turkey. Utnapishtim waited for the waters to recede, eventually opening the heavy tar-sealed hatch. Blinding sunlight poured into the pitch-black cabin. He stepped out onto the muddy, devastated mountaintop, breathing in the cold, thin air. The human race, against all mathematical odds and the supreme decree of the universe, had survived the apocalypse. Utnapishtim immediately built a crude altar, lit a fire, and offered a sacrifice of roasted meat to give thanks to his saviour. Up in the orbital space stations, the starving, traumatized Anunnaki sensors picked up the smoke and the sweet smell of roasting meat rising from the mountains below. The gods, desperate to see their Earth again, began to lower their sky chariots down through the clouds. But as the Supreme Commander, Enlil, stepped out of his spacecraft onto the muddy peak of Mount Ararat, he did not look upon the survivor with relief or joy. He looked upon Utnapishtim with an absolute, terrifying rage. The flood was supposed to be the end of the human plague, yet there stood a human being, alive, well, and breathing the air of the newly cleansed world. Enlil immediately knew that he had been betrayed, and his furious eyes snapped toward his brother Enki. The survival of humanity had been secured, but the most intense political confrontation in the history of the Anunnaki was about to begin on that muddy mountaintop. The confrontation on the muddy, devastated peak of Mount Ararat was the most intense political standoff in the history of the Anunnaki. Enlil, the Supreme Commander of Earth, had just stepped out of his gleaming sky chariot, expecting to see a lifeless, cleansed world. Instead, he smelled the smoke of a sacrificial fire and saw Utnapishtim, the human survivor, alongside his family and the salvaged genetic seeds of the Earth. Enlil was absolutely blinded by rage. He drew his weapons and turned furiously toward the Anunnaki Council, demanding to know who had broken the sacred oath of silence. Enki, the brilliant scientist and the secret savior of mankind, calmly stepped forward. He did not cower before his furious brother. Instead, he used his incredible intellect to navigate the legal trap he had been placed in. Enki argued that he had not broken his oath. He stated that he never spoke directly to a human being. He merely whispered a secret to a reed wall, and if a clever human happened to be standing on the other side and overheard the instructions to build a submarine, that was a matter of human ingenuity, not divine treason. Enlil was not a fool. He knew exactly what his brother had done. He was prepared to execute Enki and slaughter the human survivors on the spot. But then a profound shift occurred. Enlil paused and looked around at the horrific devastation of the Earth. The roaring floodwaters were slowly receding, but they had left behind a nightmarish landscape. The magnificent, sprawling megacities of Mesopotamia, Eridu, Nippur, Shuruppak, were completely gone, buried under millions of tons of suffocating brown mud. The massive agricultural fields were destroyed. The great herds of livestock were drowned. The Anunnaki gods, who had spent the last several weeks huddled in their cramped orbital space stations, were starving. They had no food, no clean water, and no shelter on the surface of the Earth. Enlil suddenly realized a chilling truth. They had destroyed their own infrastructure. The Anunnaki were now stranded on a ruined planet, and they desperately needed labor to rebuild. They needed someone to till the muddy soil, plant the seeds, and rebuild the cities. Enlil realized that he could not kill Utnapishtim. He needed him. In a stunning reversal, Enlil put away his weapons. He walked over to Utnapishtim and his wife, touched their foreheads, and offered them a divine blessing. He granted them vastly extended lifespans, elevating them to a status close to the gods themselves. The ancient Sumerian texts record that in this moment, a grand compromise was struck. The gods agreed that they would never again attempt to annihilate the human race. In return, humanity would serve as the permanent dedicated stewards of the earth. Kingship, the ancient texts say, was lowered from heaven for a second time, but the immediate logistical problem facing the Anunnaki was massive. Before the flood, they had a perfectly functioning spaceport in Mesopotamia. Their sky chariots used the towering ziggurats as navigational beacons and landing pads. Now that entire network was erased. They needed to establish a new communication grid and a new spaceport to re-establish contact with their home planet of Nibiru and resume the shipments of gold. They realized that building out of baked mud bricks was a fatal mistake. Mud bricks wash away in a cataclysm. If they were going to rebuild their planetary infrastructure, they had to build it out of the most indestructible material on Earth: solid, monolithic stone. And they had to place this new command center in a location that was geographically stable. They chose a new region, a desert land far to the west of Mesopotamia. We know this land today as Egypt. This brings us to one of the most hotly debated, awe-inspiring horizontal mysteries of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Traditional history and orthodox Egyptology will tell you that the Great Pyramid was built around 4,500 years ago as a giant, glorified tomb for a human pharaoh named Khufu. They teach us that tens of thousands of human slaves built it using nothing but copper chisels, hemp ropes, and wooden sleds. But when we look at the Great Pyramid through the lens of the Anunnaki texts and modern engineering, the tomb theory completely falls apart. First, no mummy has ever been found inside the Great Pyramid. There are no hieroglyphics praising a dead king anywhere inside its massive echoing corridors. The interior is completely devoid of the intricate art and religious texts found in actual Egyptian tombs like those in the Valley of the Kings. Instead, the Great Pyramid looks exactly like a massive, highly functional industrial machine. Let us look at the sheer, terrifying mathematics of this structure. The Great Pyramid consists of approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone. Some of the massive granite blocks used in the interior King's Chamber weigh up to 80 tons each. These 80-ton blocks were not quarried at Giza. They were cut from a quarry in Aswan, located over 500 miles away. If you ask a modern structural engineer to transport an 80-ton block of solid granite 500 miles and stack it hundreds of feet in the air, using only copper tools and wooden rollers, they will tell you it is an absolute logistical impossibility. Copper is a soft metal. It simply bends and dulls when struck against solid granite. Furthermore, the Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an astonishing margin of error of just 3/60ths of a degree. It is more accurately aligned than any modern skyscraper built with laser technology today. It sits exactly on the geographical centre of the Earth's landmass. This is not the work of primitive people dragging rocks to bury a dead king. This is the work of an advanced spacefaring civilization establishing a permanent mathematical anchor on the planet. According to ancient astronaut theorists and researchers like Zecharia Sitchin, the Giza complex was built by the Anunnaki post-flood as their new primary spaceport and navigational beacon. When the Great Pyramid was originally completed, it did not look like the rough stepped structure we see today. It was entirely encased in highly polished, brilliant white Tura limestone. It was so smooth and so reflective that when the Egyptian sun hit it, it would have shone like a massive, blinding mirror. For an Anunnaki pilot re-entering the Earth's atmosphere from deep space, this brilliant geometric beacon reflecting the sun would be the perfect visual anchor to guide their sky chariots down to the new landing zones in the Sinai Peninsula. But the pyramids of Egypt were only one part of the new global grid. The Great Flood had violently altered the geography of the Earth. Massive tectonic shifts had cracked open the crust in new areas, exposing fresh, untouched veins of gold and precious metals. The Anunnaki realized they needed to expand their operations far beyond the Middle East and Africa. They sent expeditions across the oceans to the newly exposed mineral-rich mountain ranges of South America. Deep in the Andes Mountains, in modern-day Bolivia, we find the ruins of Pumapunku and Tiwanaku. To a casual observer, it just looks like a field of scattered grey rocks. But if you look closely at these stones, you will see something that absolutely defies conventional history. The stones at Pumapunku are made of andesite and diorite, some of the hardest volcanic rocks on the planet. Yet, these stones are cut with laser-like precision. They feature perfectly straight, right-angle grooves, perfectly drilled circular holes, and complex H-shapes that interlock like perfectly machined Lego bricks. Mainstream archaeologists claim these stones were carved by indigenous tribes using harder rocks to pound the softer rocks. But modern stonemasons and machinists have openly stated that achieving the smooth, glass-like finish and the perfect millimetre-exact geometries found at Pumapunku would require diamond-tipped saws, advanced milling machines, and modern power tools. If we apply the Anunnaki narrative, Pumapunku was not a primitive temple. It was a sprawling, high-tech metallurgical plant and a spaceport for the South American mining operations. The massive interlocking stones were the heavy foundations required to support heavy industrial machinery or the landing gears of massive spacecraft. The site was later destroyed, either by a secondary cataclysm, a localized earthquake, or, as later Anunnaki texts suggest, a devastating war between the gods themselves. As the Anunnaki spread their new megalithic grid across the globe, from the pyramids of Egypt to the massive stone complexes of South America and to the meticulously planned cities of the Indus Valley, the relationship with humanity entered a new, highly structured phase. The gods realized that they could no longer micromanage the rapidly multiplying human population. There were simply too many humans and not enough pure-blooded Anunnaki to oversee them. So, the Anunnaki formally instituted the concept of the divine right of kings. They selected specific human families, often those who still carried a higher concentration of Anunnaki genetics from the pre-flood days, and elevated them to the status of pharaohs, emperors, and high priests. The gods stepped back into the shadows of the temples. They retreated to the high security inner sanctums of the rebuilt ziggurats and the pyramids. They communicated their orders to the human kings, and the kings enforced those orders upon the masses. Humanity was taught writing again, given advanced agricultural calendars, and taught the laws of civilization. This is the exact moment in history where conventional archaeology and the Anunnaki narrative perfectly intersect. Mainstream historians have always been baffled by how the great civilizations of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley all seem to burst into existence at roughly the exact same time, already possessing fully formed writing systems, complex laws, and advanced architecture with no slow period of evolution. The ancient texts give us the answer. They did not evolve these skills slowly. The blueprint of civilization was handed to them as a complete packaged system by extraterrestrial survivors desperate to rebuild their shattered mining colony. The era of Reconstruction was a golden age of human advancement. We built monuments that still defy our modern engineering capabilities. We learned the movements of the stars, the secrets of medicine, and the structure of society. But this golden age was built on a deeply fragile foundation. The humans were obedient, but the Anunnaki gods themselves were not. As the human population stabilized, and the gold shipments to Nibiru resumed, the old bitter rivalries between the royal extraterrestrial families began to violently resurface. The new megalithic grid was about to become the battleground for a devastating high-tech war of the gods, and the weapons they were preparing to use would leave scars on the earth that can still be measured today. The era of Reconstruction, after the Great Flood, should have been an eternal golden age for both humanity and the gods. The new global megalithic grid was fully operational. The pyramids of Egypt were serving as pristine navigational beacons, and the human population was thriving under the orderly management of the newly appointed human kings. But peace, especially among highly advanced, ambitious beings, is often fragile. As the centuries passed, the original, exhausted Anunnaki commanders, Enki and Enlil, began to step back from the daily management of the Earth colony. This power vacuum opened the door for a younger, far more aggressive generation of Anunnaki royalty to seize control. This generational shift ignited a terrifying high-tech Game of Thrones that would ultimately lead to the catastrophic downfall of the Sumerian civilization. To understand this conflict, we must introduce the two most prominent figures of this younger generation, Marduk and Inanna. Marduk was the firstborn son of Enki. Much like his father, he was brilliant. But unlike Enki, Marduk possessed a burning, insatiable desire for absolute political supremacy. Marduk believed that because his father had created humanity and saved them from the flood, he was the rightful, undisputed ruler of the entire earth. He established his stronghold in the ancient city of Babylon, declaring it the new supreme center of the world. On the other side of the royal family tree was Inanna, the granddaughter of Enlil, known later to the Akkadians and Babylonians as Ishtar. She was a fierce, highly ambitious, and strategically brilliant goddess. Inanna commanded immense respect and controlled vast territories of the earth, frequently depicted in ancient art flying in her own heavily armed sky chariot and wielding advanced weaponry. She absolutely refused to bow down to Marduk's demands for global domination. The rivalry between Marduk and Inanna quickly escalated from bitter political arguments in the council chambers to full-scale, devastating proxy wars. This is where the dynamic of human history took a profoundly dark turn. The ancient texts, such as the Era Epos, describe how the Anunnaki gods began using their newly established human kingdoms as pawns on a massive global chessboard. Human armies, armed with bronze swords and shields, were sent to slaughter each other by the thousands, commanded by alien generals fighting for control of the Earth's strategic assets. But as the wars dragged on, human armies proved to be too slow and too ineffective for Marduk. He decided to make a massive, deeply terrifying strategic move. He and his loyal forces marched on the Sinai Peninsula. Why the Sinai Peninsula? If we remember the post-flood reconstruction, the Sinai was the central hub of the new Anunnaki spaceport. It was the only place on Earth where the massive sky chariots could launch and land to transport the refined gold back to the home planet of Nibiru. By capturing the Sinai spaceport, Marduk would not just control the Earth, he would control the absolute lifeline of the Anunnaki species. He could hold the entire home planet of Nibiru hostage. For Enlil and the High Council of the Gods, this was an unthinkable red line. They could not allow a rebellious prince to seize control of the intergalactic spaceport. The council convened in a state of absolute panic. They realised that conventional warfare could not stop Marduk's rapidly advancing forces. In a moment of sheer desperation, Enlil authorised the unthinkable. He unlocked the ancient Anunnaki arsenal and authorised the use of the weapons of terror. To understand what the weapons of terror were, we must look at the physical evidence left behind in the Middle East, alongside the harrowing descriptions in ancient texts. The Sumerian tablets describe these weapons as possessing an unseen power, capable of unleashing a brilliant, blinding light and a scorching fire that turns rock into dust and boils the rivers. Thousands of years later, this exact same event was recorded in the biblical book of Genesis as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain. The Bible describes burning sulfur and fire raining down from the heavens, completely vaporizing the cities and turning Lot's wife into a pillar of salt when she was caught in the terrifying blast wave. But is this just religious mythology, or is there physical scientific evidence of ancient weapons of mass destruction? If you travel to the Sinai Peninsula today, specifically to the area suspected to be the ancient Anunnaki spaceport, you will find something that deeply troubles modern geologists. Vast tracts of the desert are covered in strange blackened stones that appear to have been subjected to unimaginably high, instantaneous temperatures. Even more baffling, deep in certain parts of the Middle Eastern and North African deserts, explorers have found massive sheets of pale green, translucent glass scattered across the sand. Modern science has a very specific name for this type of desert glass: trinitite. We know exactly how it is formed because we've created it ourselves. In 1945, when the United States military detonated the very first atomic bomb in the desert of New Mexico during the Trinity test, the extreme instantaneous heat of the nuclear blast, reaching millions of degrees, melted the desert sand and fused it into sheets of radioactive green glass. The presence of identical desert glass in ancient, prehistoric contexts suggests a terrifying horizontal parallel. The Anunnaki did not just use fire, they deployed highly advanced tactical nuclear or radiological weapons. The ancient texts explicitly detail the deployment of these weapons. Two Anunnaki commanders, known in the texts as Ninurta and Nergal, flew their sky chariots over the Sinai spaceport and the rebellious Canaanite cities. They dropped the weapons of terror. The explosions completely vaporized the spaceport, melting the massive stone facilities into glass and ash. The rebellious cities of the plain were wiped off the face of the earth in a series of blinding flashes. Marduk's forces were completely annihilated. The immediate tactical objective was achieved, but Enlil and the Anunnaki commanders had made a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated the unpredictable, terrifying nature of the Earth's weather systems. When you detonate a nuclear weapon, the initial blast and the intense heat are only the first part of the horror. The explosion vaporizes irradiated soil, dust and debris, sucking it up into a massive mushroom cloud high in the atmosphere. This highly radioactive material, known as fallout, is then carried by the high-altitude winds, dropping a silent, invisible curtain of death over everything in its path. The Sumerian texts describe this exact phenomenon with absolutely chilling scientific accuracy. They called it the evil wind. Following the destruction of the Sinai spaceport, a massive storm front moved in from the Mediterranean Sea. The strong winds caught the radioactive fallout from the blast zone and began blowing it directly eastward. Directly in the path of this invisible radioactive cloud was the heart of the Sumerian civilization, the magnificent, densely populated mega-cities of Mesopotamia. The historical artifact known as the Lament for Ur is one of the most heartbreaking and terrifying documents ever recovered from the ancient world. Traditional historians have long categorized it as a poetic metaphor for a famine or a natural storm. But if you read the exact words translated from the cuneiform clay tablets, it does not describe a natural storm of wind and rain. It perfectly describes the gruesome, horrifying symptoms of acute radiation sickness. The tablet reads, "A storm, the evil wind, went around in the heavens. It caused cities to be destroyed, houses to be destroyed. It caused the people to be terrified. On the people, a disease was placed. Those who were struck by the storm, their skin peeled off. The wind made their hair fall out. They coughed up their own blood. The water of the rivers turned bitter and poisonous." The texts explicitly state that this was an enemy that could not be fought with bronze swords or thick city walls. It is a storm that has no physical form, the ancient scribes wrote. It passes through the highest walls. It seeps through the thickest doors like a phantom. The people of Sumer did not die of battle wounds, they died invisibly, their cellular structure breaking down from the intense gamma radiation sweeping through the streets. The animals dropped dead in the fields. The crops withered and turned to grey ash. The cradle of civilization was turning into an irradiated graveyard. As the evil wind swept across the Fertile Crescent, absolute panic seized the Anunnaki gods themselves. They were physical, biological beings, and despite their advanced genetics, they were not immune to lethal doses of radiation. The texts describe a chaotic, terrifying evacuation. The gods abandoned their magnificent ziggurats. They abandoned their temples and their hoards of wealth. They ran to their remaining sky chariots, desperately launching themselves into the sky, just as the invisible cloud of death washed over their cities. From the safety of the upper atmosphere, the Anunnaki looked down at the complete and utter destruction of their Earth colony. The Sinai spaceport was vaporized. The magnificent cities of Mesopotamia were silent, filled only with the decaying bodies of the human workforce. The agricultural fields were highly radioactive and completely useless. The Earth, once a vibrant, resource-rich paradise, had been poisoned by their own internal petty warfare. But there was a profound cosmic irony to this tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of Earth years had passed since Enki first splashed down in the Persian Gulf. According to the texts, the massive shipments of gold had successfully done their job. The atmospheric shield around the home planet of Nibiru had been repaired and stabilized. The Anunnaki no longer needed the Earth for its resources. The survival mission that had brought them across the freezing void of space was ultimately complete. With their primary spaceport destroyed, the Earth heavily irradiated and their home planet saved, the Supreme Council of the Anunnaki made their final, monumental decision. It was time to go home. One by one, the massive mother ships broke orbit, firing their thrusters and heading back into the deep, dark expanse of the solar system, charting a course for Nibiru. They took their advanced technology, their deep understanding of the cosmos, and their majestic sky chariots with them. But they did not take humanity. The human race, the biological masterpiece engineered by Enki, was left behind in the radioactive ashes. The humans who had managed to survive the evil wind by hiding in the deep mountains or the far corners of the globe emerged into a completely shattered world. The towering gods who had ruled their lives, dictated their laws, and provided their food were suddenly, inexplicably gone. The skies were empty. Humanity was now completely alone. We were suffering from profound planetary amnesia. We had been genetically engineered to serve, and suddenly we were forced to survive on our own. We looked at the massive empty pyramids, the silent crumbling ziggurats, and the glowing glassy sands of the desert, trying desperately to remember the knowledge that had been taken from us. This brutal abandonment would force humanity into a desperate struggle to piece together the fragments of a forgotten truth, giving birth to the final, enduring legacy of the Anunnaki. When the roaring engines of the Anunnaki motherships faded into the deep silence of space, humanity was left standing in the ruins of a forgotten golden age. The gods had departed, taking their brilliant science and their majestic sky chariots with them, leaving us to inherit a traumatized, irradiated Earth. But they did not leave us entirely empty-handed. As our ancestors crawled out of the ashes and began to rebuild on their own, they clung desperately to the shattered fragments of knowledge the Anunnaki had left behind. Over the millennia, as the physical reality of the extraterrestrial colonists faded into distant memory, these fragments were transformed by the human mind. The advanced genetic laboratories in the African Absu were remembered as magical gardens of Eden. The horrific radioactive weapons of terror were recorded as divine fire and brimstone raining from angry heavens. The massive stone spaceports and ziggurats became sacred temples for silent worship. The highly advanced biological astronauts who engineered us were elevated into ethereal, omnipotent gods. In our desperate attempt to understand a forgotten history, humanity inadvertently birthed what we now call religion. Yet, buried deep within those ancient religious texts, the spark of Anunnaki intellect, the foundations of mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture, survived, ultimately giving birth to modern science. Whether you choose to view the ancient Sumerian clay tablets as a literal historical record of extraterrestrial intervention, or simply as a magnificent, elaborate mythology invented by our visionary ancestors, the profound impact of the story remains undeniable. The tale of the Anunnaki perfectly mirrors our own modern human anxieties. It's a story about the desperate exploitation of a planet's natural resources, the ethical terrors of genetic engineering, and the devastating consequences of advanced, civilization-ending weaponry. Most importantly, it reflects humanity's eternal burning desire to look up at the stars and ask, where did we come from? And are we truly alone in the dark? According to the ancient text, the vast elliptical orbit of Nibiru takes 3,600 Earth years to complete. The cosmic clock is always ticking. The rogue planet will inevitably swing back into the inner solar system. And when it does, if those who from heaven to earth came decide to return to their ancient outpost, what kind of world will they find? Will they look down upon a failed biological experiment that destroyed its own planet? Or will they find a thriving, highly advanced civilization ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with its creators? Thank you for joining us on this massive, incredible journey into the greatest archaeological mystery in human history. If this deep dive through the ancient sands of Mesopotamia has shifted your perspective on human origins, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an adventure into the unknown. We want to hear from you. Do you believe the Anunnaki were real, physical visitors? Or is this all just a beautiful ancient myth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning the past and keep looking up at the stars.